This was probably 15 years ago now, maybe a little more. I was working as a freelance photojournalist at the time, which sounds more glamorous than it was. Mostly I was scraping together assignments from regional magazines and the occasional documentary outlet, covering anything they'd pay me to cover. I was good at it, but I was broke, which is a combination that makes you say yes to things you'd otherwise think twice about. The assignment came through a documentary production company based in London. It was a small outfit company, 2 or 3 people running it. They were putting together a long-form piece on abandoned Cold War infrastructure, and they needed a photographer who could work independently in the field without much supervision. Someone gave them my name and they reached out. The location was a decommissioned Soviet-era radar installation in the Czech Republic. I won't give the exact name because I looked it up recently and it's apparently become a minor tourist attraction, and I don't want what I'm about to describe to be tied to any specific place in a way that gets back to me. What I'll say is that it was in a forested area in the western part of the country, about 2 hours from Prague, and it had been abandoned since the early 90s when the Soviet military pulled out. The site had been used to track NATO aircraft during the Cold War. There were several large antenna structures, underground bunker sections, surface-level operations buildings, the whole setup. Officially, the site was derelict and off-limits to the public. The production company had obtained some kind of access arrangement through a Czech heritage organization, the details of which were never fully explained to me. All I knew was that I had a document with official-looking stamps on it, a contact name at the heritage organization, and instructions to meet a local guide at a specific road junction at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I flew into Prague the night before, rented a car, drove out early, and found the junction without much trouble. The guide was already there when I arrived. His name was Radek. He was probably in his late 40s, heavy-set, spoke decent English with a thick accent. He had a handheld radio clipped to his jacket and a clipboard with what looked like a site map on it. He seemed professional enough. We shook hands and he gave me a brief rundown of the site before we drove in. The access road was unpaved and ran about 1 kilometer through dense pine forest before opening onto the site itself. The first thing that struck me was the scale of it. The antenna structures were enormous, rusted lattices of steel rising maybe 40 or 50 meters out of the tree line, and the operations buildings were large, prefab concrete blocks, windows long since broken out, the walls stained with years of weather and moss. It was exactly what the production company wanted photographically. I started shooting. Radek was fairly relaxed for the first couple of hours. He walked with me between buildings, pointed out which structures were stable enough to enter, and which ones I should avoid. He told me a little about the history of the site, what each building had been used for, where the underground sections connected. He seemed knowledgeable, and I had no reason to doubt anything he was telling me. Around midday, we entered the largest of the surface buildings, the main operations block. It was a long structure, maybe 60 meters end to end, with a central corridor and rooms branching off on either side. Most of the rooms were empty, just bare concrete, old cable conduits along the walls, light fixtures hanging loose from the ceilings. I was working my way down the corridor shooting when I noticed something in one of the side rooms that I initially assumed was just debris. It was a sleeping bag, rolled up and pushed against the wall in the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of shelving. I looked at it for a moment and then looked more carefully at the room. There was a camping stove on the floor near the window, a small one, the kind that runs on a gas canister. Next to it were 2 empty food tins. The labels were still on them and they weren't rusted, which meant they hadn't been there long. I called Radek in. He stood in the doorway and looked at the sleeping bag and the stove and said nothing for a few seconds. Then he told me it was probably left by urban explorers, that the site attracted them occasionally, and it was a known problem. He said it in a way that was a little too measured, like he'd already prepared the answer. I didn't push it. I took some photos and we moved on. We spent another hour working through the rest of the building. I was focused on what I was doing, and the urban explorer explanation had more or less satisfied me. We reached the far end of the corridor, and Radek told me there was a lower level accessible through a stairwell at the end. Underground section, he said, communications relay room and a small operations cell. He said the ceiling was intact and it was safe to go down. I went down first. The stairwell was narrow and dark, and my flashlight was doing most of the work by the time I reached the bottom. The lower level was a single long room with a low ceiling, old equipment racks along both walls, most of them empty. I stopped walking and stood still for a moment. At the far end, maybe 20 meters away, there were two people. They were standing close together against the wall in the dark, beyond the reach of my flashlight until I pointed it directly at them. A man and a woman, they were both adults and looking directly at me. I took a step back toward the stairwell and called up for Radek. I heard him at the top of the stairs, but he didn't come down. He called back, asking what was wrong. I told him there were people down here. For some time, he said nothing, and then he said something in Czech, not to me, to someone else up there. I heard a second voice respond. I hadn't known there was anyone else at the top of those stairs. I backed up to the stairwell without turning away from the two people at the end of the room. They still hadn't moved. I went up the stairs fast, and when I came out at the top, I found Radek standing with another man I'd never seen before. He was younger, wearing a jacket with no markings on it. Radek looked at me and immediately started explaining that the two people downstairs were squatters, that this was an ongoing issue, that the Heritage Organization was aware of it and dealing with it. I asked him why there was a second person with him and who that person was. He said the man was a colleague who had driven out separately to help document the squatter situation. I asked him why he hadn't mentioned any of this when we arrived. He didn't answer that question. He just said we should move to the next building. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a nervous person by nature, and I've worked in places that were genuinely dangerous. What unsettled me in that moment wasn't the two people in the basement, strange as that was. It was Radek, the way he responded too quickly. The way there was already someone else standing there when I came up those stairs, someone who had arrived at some point during the hour we'd been in that building, without either of us hearing a vehicle on that gravel access road. I told Radek I was done for the day. He nodded like he'd been expecting that. The drive back out through the forest to the access road was completely silent. He dropped me at my car at the junction, and before I drove away, he told me, very deliberately, that the documentation I'd been given only covered my access to the site and didn't give me any right to report what I'd seen to outside parties. He framed it as a legal clarification. I'm fairly certain it wasn't. I contacted the production company that evening and told them what had happened. They were sympathetic, but vague. They said they'd look into it and get back to me. I never heard from them again on the subject. I filed the assignment, they paid me, and that was the end of our working relationship. I tried reaching the Heritage Organization directly. I had the contact name from the original documentation. The email bounced. I tried a phone number I found associated with the organization online, and it rang out every time. I've thought about those two people in the basement a lot over the years. They could have been squatters. That's the simple explanation, and it's not impossible. But squatters don't just stand silently in the dark watching you, and they don't explain Radek, or the man at the top of the stairs, or the way the Heritage Organization disappeared the moment I tried to follow up. The thing I keep coming back to is that Radek knew. Whatever was happening in that facility, he knew about it before we walked in that morning. The urban explorer explanation, the prepared response, the legal warning at the end. None of that is how someone behaves when they're surprised. I should have pushed harder at the time. I know that. But I was alone out there, and I had no leverage, and I made the calculation that getting out was more important than getting answers. I still think that was the right call. I'm just not entirely sure anymore.